I used to think my life was pretty much a done deal. Successful career, a beautiful wife, a teenage son who didn't get into too much trouble. You know, the whole American dream package. My wife, Victoria, was everything I ever wanted. Smart, stunning, and with just the right amount of sass to keep things interesting. But if I had known what was coming, I might have paid a little more attention to those charity events she started attending almost religiously. It all started with those damn charity events. They weren't out of character at first. Victoria's always had a bleeding heart for causes that came with fancy dinners and expensive wine. But when the events became almost a weekly thing, I started feeling like a single dad. Our son, Liam, joked that she loved orphans more than us, and while we laughed it off at the time, there was something in his eyes that made me uneasy. Then came Richard, our chauffeur. I hired him a year ago when we started hosting clients more frequently. He was polished, punctual, and practically part of the background. Victoria even joked about how he looked like a young Clark Gable. Tall, dark hair slicked back, with a voice smooth enough to charm church ladies. I remember rolling my eyes, not thinking twice about it. Looking back now, I was a goddamn idiot. For months, I didn't suspect a thing. Victoria would come home late, smelling like perfume and wine, tossing her heels by the door with a sigh, and I figured it was just exhaustion. But the cracks were there, subtle but growing. Conversations became clipped, her phone was suddenly glued to her hand, and our weekends became hers alone. Brunches, meetings, emergencies that never seemed to end. It wasn't until that one night at dinner that the first domino fell. Liam, halfway through his burger, blurted out, "Saw Mom kissing the driver today." The words hit like a freight train. I barked out a laugh, expecting Victoria to roll her eyes or smack him playfully. But instead, she froze, the wine glass halfway to her lips. The room went deathly quiet. The only sound the ticking of that damn grandfather clock she insisted on buying. "What did you just say?" I heard myself ask, the words feeling foreign in my own mouth. Liam looked between us, confused and a little scared. Yeah. When I was coming back from practice, I saw you by the garage, Mom. You kissed Richard. Thought it was weird." Victoria's face drained of color. She stuttered something about gratitude. A friendly kiss, but even as she spoke, the lie unraveled. I wanted to believe her. I needed to believe her, but something cold and dark coiled in my gut, telling me that this was just the start. I didn't confront her that night. Couldn't. Instead, I spent half the night in the office, whiskey burning down my throat, replaying every late-night return, every charity event, every time she claimed her phone died, every damn detail that suddenly didn't add up. By morning, I knew I had to get answers. I didn't know how deep the betrayal went or how much of my life was built on lies, but I sure as hell was going to find out. And God helped them both when I did. Sleep was out of the question that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Victoria in Richard's arms, her lips on his. I spent hours in my office instead, swirling the last of my whiskey and staring at the darkened screen of my laptop, fingers itching to pull up her phone records, her emails, her social media, anything that could either confirm or deny what Liam had seen. But I didn't. Not yet. I needed proof, something undeniable. By dawn, I'd made up my mind. If Victoria was hiding something, I was going to drag it into the light. The first step was subtle. I called in sick to the office, told my assistant to handle my meetings, and headed to the city to hire a private investigator. His name was Nolan, a guy recommended by an old college friend who'd used him during a messy divorce. Nolan didn't ask a lot of questions, just scribbled down details as I talked. The late nights, the charity events, Richard. When I mentioned the kiss Liam saw, he just nodded and said, "We'll find out the truth, one way or another." His confidence was almost reassuring. Almost. The next few days were torture. Victoria acted normal. Too normal. Like she'd rehearsed every word, every smile. I couldn't decide if I wanted to confront her or pretend I'd imagined the whole thing. But every time Liam walked into the room, the guilt twisted in my gut, raw and unforgiving. How long had my kid been carrying that secret around? How much had he seen that he hadn't said? On Friday afternoon, I got the call. Nolan, voice steady and professional, said he had something. We met at a diner across town. One of those greasy spoon joints where no one pays attention to who you are or why you're there. He slid an envelope across the table without a word. My hands shook as I opened it. Inside were photos. Crystal clear, no room for doubt. Victoria and Richard in the backseat of the car, parked at the edge of a lot I didn't recognize. Her fingers twisted in his hair, his hand on her waist, mouths locked. Another shot of them slipping into a hotel, the kind with hourly rates and a flickering neon sign. The timestamps left no doubt. While I was sitting at my desk drafting contracts, my wife was spending her afternoons in bed with the damn driver. My first instinct was to smash something, anything. But Nolan's eyes were on me, watching for a reaction. I gripped the edge of the table until my knuckles turned white, swallowing down the bile rising in my throat. How long? I managed to choke out. 6 months, maybe longer, Nolan said quietly. They're careful, different hotels, different routes. But they've got a routine. Wednesday afternoons and Fridays, mostly. Fridays, of course. The one day I stayed late at the office for budget meetings. She knew I wouldn't be home until late. Knew I'd never think twice if she came home after I did. Smelling like vanilla perfume and guilt. I forced out one last question. Does Liam know? Nolan hesitated. Doubt it. The kid's smart, but they're careful. The kiss was probably the worst he's seen. Small mercies, I guess. The ride home was a blur. I parked 2 blocks down, heart pounding in my ears, and stared at our house. The perfectly manicured lawn, the porch swing Victoria had insisted on, the soft glow from the kitchen window. Everything looked so damn normal. But now I knew better. I sat there for 20 minutes, hands shaking on the steering wheel, trying to figure out my next move. Calling her out right then would lead to a screaming match that Liam didn't deserve. I needed to be smart about this, make sure I had every last piece of evidence before I blew it all up. So, I walked in like nothing was wrong. Victoria was in the kitchen, hair pulled back, humming to some old jazz record she liked. She turned and smiled, a real smile that used to make my whole day. Now it just made me sick. "Hey, babe," she greeted, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "How was work?" "Fine," I lied, pressing a kiss to her cheek, forcing myself not to recoil at the scent of her perfume. The same one she wore in those photos. "Just tired." "Well, dinner's almost ready," she said, oblivious. "Lasagna, your favorite." Of course. I smiled. God, it hurt. Mumbled something about needing a shower, and escaped upstairs. In our bedroom, I locked the door, slid to the floor, and buried my face in my hands. The rage I'd been holding back all day roared to life, suffocating, raw. It took everything in me not to rip the room apart. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay beside Victoria, watching the rise and fall of her breath, fingers itching to shake her awake and demand why. But I stayed silent, jaw clenched so hard it ached. I needed a plan, evidence, divorce papers that would leave her with nothing. When she rolled over, half asleep, and draped an arm over my chest, I had to fight the urge to shove her off. Her head settled on my shoulder, and the words slipped out, soft and venomous. "Do you even love me anymore?" She mumbled something that sounded like "of course," snuggling closer, oblivious to the betrayal that hung between us, thick as smoke. But her wedding ring was on the nightstand instead of her finger, and somehow that said more than any words could. In the dark, I stared at the ceiling. The pictures from the envelope burned into my memory. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. By morning I had a plan, if you could call it that. My thoughts were a tangled mess of revenge fantasies and bitter questions. But one thing was clear. Victoria wasn't walking away from this unscathed. Neither was Richard. I wasn't sure how I'd do it yet, but I'd see them both burn before I let them make a fool of me any longer. First things first, I called Nolan. If I was going to rip my life apart, I needed to do it clean. We met at his office, a cramped space in a strip mall that reeked of burnt coffee and desperation. Nolan didn't waste time. He slapped another envelope onto the desk, the second wave of evidence. Inside were more photos, receipts from hotels, call logs between Victoria and Richard. But it was the audio that made my blood turn to ice. Nolan had tapped Richard's phone, and the recording was clear as day. Victoria's voice, laughing, breathless, saying things I didn't want to hear, things she used to say to me. I made it through about 10 seconds before slamming the tape recorder off, my hands trembling with rage. "I need everything you can get," I bit out. "Emails, texts, bank statements. I want to know where every dollar's gone and how long this has been going on." Nolan just nodded, eyes hard. "Give me a week. But there's one more thing." He slid a small black flash drive across the desk. "Security footage from the Fairmont Hotel. Last Friday." I plugged it into my laptop with numb fingers. The screen flickered to life, showing Victoria in that damn red dress she'd bought for charity events, striding into the hotel lobby, her hand curled around Richard's arm. My heart twisted painfully, but I forced myself to watch. Forced myself to see every damning second. They were laughing. She looked happy. Happier than she had in months. And then they disappeared into the elevator, the doors closing with a soft chime. I shut the laptop with a snap and raked a hand through my hair, breathing hard. The betrayal was suffocating, but the rage cut through it like a knife. They were so damn confident, so sure they'd never get caught. And I couldn't wait to wipe those smug smiles off their faces. Over the next few days, I played the part of the unsuspecting husband like a pro. At breakfast, I smiled at Victoria's small talk, nodded at her stories about charity auctions and luncheons with her girlfriends. I took Liam to his soccer practices, tried to act normal even when my hands shook with the need to punch something, preferably Richard's face. The hardest part was pretending to touch her, to kiss her cheek as I left for work, to wrap an arm around her waist when we ran into neighbors at the grocery store. Every time her fingers skimmed mine, it took everything in me not to jerk away. But I couldn't risk tipping her off. Not yet. At night, I barely slept. I spent hours in my office, poring over phone bills and bank statements, digging for anything Nolan might have missed. And I found things. God, did I find things. Thousands withdrawn from our accounts, dinners at restaurants I'd never heard of, payments to a boutique hotel 2 towns over. Every new discovery felt like another knife in the back. And still, I needed more. The breaking point came a week later. Victoria had an event downtown, a fundraiser for some children's hospital, or at least that's what she said. I pretended to believe her, even pressed a kiss to her cheek before watching her drive off in that sleek white BMW I bought her for our 10th anniversary. As soon as she rounded the corner, I was in my car, tires squealing as I tore down the street. Nolan had texted an address. A hotel again, but not the usual. More discreet, tucked between an office park and a row of cafes. I parked down the street and waited, engine idling, fingers drumming impatiently on the steering wheel. 30 minutes later, a black Mercedes glided into the lot. Victoria stepped out, red dress skimming her thighs, blonde hair gleaming under the streetlights. Richard emerged from the driver's side, all broad shoulders and smug confidence. When he leaned in to kiss her, something in me snapped. I was out of the car without thinking, fists clenched, vision red. I don't remember crossing the lot, don't remember throwing open the hotel door, but suddenly I was in the hallway, following the sound of their laughter to a suite on the 2nd floor. The door wasn't even locked. I shoved it open so hard it crashed into the wall, and the sight that met me stole the breath from my lungs. Victoria, pinned against the wall, lips swollen and dress half unzipped, Richard's hands on her waist, mouths fused. They tore apart at the sound, eyes wide with horror. For a moment, none of us moved, frozen in a sick tableau. Then Richard lunged, stammering something about explanations, but I was faster. My fist connected with his jaw with a sickening crunch, sending him crashing to the floor. Victoria screamed, scrambling backward, eyes wild and terrified. "Max, wait! I can explain." "Explain." I laughed, the sound harsh and broken. "Go ahead, Vic. Explain how my wife's screwing the chauffeur. I can't wait to hear this." She opened her mouth, eyes glistening with tears, but I was already turning away, chest heaving. My knuckles throbbed, blood dripped from Richard's mouth, and I couldn't stay there another second. The walls were closing in, suffocating. I barely made it to the parking lot before I doubled over, hands on my knees, gasping for air. My head spun, nausea rising, but underneath it all, there was something darker. A twisted, ugly satisfaction. I had them. I had the proof. And by God, I was going to make them pay. As I slid behind the wheel, tires squealing as I tore out of the lot, I caught one last glimpse of Victoria in the doorway, dress hanging off her shoulders, eyes wide and horrified. And for once, I didn't feel a shred of guilt. I gripped the wheel tighter, jaw clenched. This was war now, and I was just getting started. I didn't go home that night. Couldn't. The idea of facing Victoria, of looking into those eyes and pretending I didn't see the way she looked at Richard, made my skin crawl. So I drove aimlessly through the city, tires humming against asphalt, trying to drown out the images that wouldn't stop replaying in my mind. Her dress slipping off her shoulders, Richard's hands on her waist, the way she'd gasped my name, eyes wide with guilt and something else. By midnight, I was parked outside a bar off 7th, nursing a whiskey I barely tasted. The place was nearly empty, just a few sad souls hunched over drinks, but that was fine by me. Less chance of running into someone I knew. Less chance of explaining why my knuckles were split and bruised or why my eyes were rimmed red. The bartender gave me a wary look when I ordered my 4th glass, but I shot him a glare that shut him up quick. The burn of alcohol was the only thing keeping me steady. I'd lost count of how many times I replayed the scene at the hotel, every detail twisting the knife deeper. I should have seen it coming. Every late night, every excuse, every time she came home smelling like someone else's cologne. But I was too blind, too trusting, too damn stupid. My phone buzzed in my pocket for the 5th time, Victoria's name lighting up the screen. I let it ring. Her voicemails were all the same. Please, Max, just let me explain. But I couldn't stomach the sound of her voice. What the hell was there to explain? Anyway, I'd seen enough to know the truth. The rest was just details. It was nearly 2 a.m. when I finally dragged myself out of the bar, vision blurred and steps unsteady. I called an Uber. No way in hell I was driving, and slumped into the back seat, head pounding. The driver eyed me in the rear view but didn't ask questions. Smart man. But instead of heading home, I gave him Nolan's address. If I was going to tear my life apart, I wanted to make sure I didn't miss a single piece. Nolan answered the door in sweats and a threadbare t-shirt, eyes bleary with sleep. His scowl deepened when he saw the state I was in, but he stepped aside without a word, letting me in. The apartment was cramped, smelling faintly of burnt coffee and stale air. No family photos, no clutter. Just stacks of files and an ancient computer that whirred ominously when he booted it up. "You look like hell," Nolan muttered, shoving a mug of black coffee into my hands. "Feel worse?" I grunted, downing half of it in one go. The bitterness helped clear my head. But only just. "Tell me you've got something." "Depends what you want." Nolan leaned back, rubbing a hand over his jaw. "If you're asking if she's cheating, then yeah. Got more than enough to bury her in court. But something's off." My grip tightened on the mug. "Off how?" He hesitated, pulling up a folder on his desktop. I dug into Richard. Guy squeaky clean, no priors, no debts, no record. But then I checked his bank statements. He double-clicked a file, and a spreadsheet popped up, numbers and dates blurring together. $5,000, Nolan said, jabbing a finger at a line of deposits. Transferred monthly from an offshore account. Started about 7 months ago. My eyes narrowed. Victoria's paying him? No, Nolan said slowly. It's not her account. Belongs to an LLC registered out of Delaware, one of those shell companies people use to hide money. I'm still tracing it, but get this. The account owner's tied to a man named Bryce Langford. The name hit like a slap to the face. Langford, my biggest competitor. We'd been at each other's throats for years, underbidding contracts and poaching clients. The smug bastard had even made a bid to buy out my company last year, which I'd promptly told him to shove. "You think Langford's paying Richard?" I snapped. "Looks that way." Nolan's eyes glinted. Probably paid him to get close to your wife. Dig up dirt, maybe even sabotage a few deals. The pieces clicked into place, ugly and twisted. Richard wasn't just screwing my wife, he was a goddamn plant. And Victoria, clueless or not, had handed him every damn secret I'd tried to keep locked down. I barked out a laugh, sharp and humorless. Son of a... Nolan smirked. Messy, huh? Messy? I shoved to my feet, nearly toppling the chair. That smug bastard, he set me up. Used my own wife against me. Looks that way, Nolan said, leaning back. So, what's the plan? I raked a hand through my hair, heart hammering. This wasn't just an affair. It was a goddamn setup. I'd been so focused on Victoria that I hadn't seen the real threat sneaking in through the back door. A plan was already forming, dark and vindictive. Langford thought he could play me, thought he could use Victoria and Richard to bury me. But two could play at that game. Nolan, I said, voice cold and steady. I need everything you can dig up on Langford. Bank accounts, business deals, offshore money, anything I can use to sink him. Nolan's grin was all teeth. Now we're talking. By the time I finally stumbled into my own bed, it was nearly dawn. Victoria was already asleep, her back to me, blonde hair spilling over her pillow. In the soft morning light, she looked so damn innocent it almost hurt. But the flash drive in my pocket felt like a brand, hot and damning. I stared at the ceiling, exhaustion dragging at me, but sleep wouldn't come. All I could think about was revenge, on Richard, on Langford, and maybe, just maybe, on the woman lying next to me who had destroyed everything we built. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. I spent the next few days playing a part. Pretending to be clueless, pretending not to notice the way Victoria flinched every time I looked at her. It took everything in me not to snap, not to shove the photos in her face and demand to know how long she'd been making a fool of me. But until I had every last detail on Langford, I had to bide my time. Nolan worked fast. By midweek, I had a file the size of a small novel, emails, financial transfers, shell companies. Langford had been busy. The smug bastard hadn't just paid off Richard to seduce Victoria. He'd bought out 3 of my suppliers, sabotaged 2 deals in the pipeline, and fed my own blueprints to competitors. I'd been so busy playing house I hadn't seen him carving out my foundation brick by brick. But that wasn't even the worst of it. Nolan dropped a bombshell Wednesday morning. Richard wasn't just some hired pretty boy. He was ex-military, dishonorably discharged for conduct unbecoming an officer. Which, as Nolan cheerfully put it, was a polite way of saying he got caught with his hand in the cookie jar. And he wasn't working alone. Langford had an entire network feeding him information, executive assistants, IT guys, even a receptionist at my own office. Every page of that file was a fresh betrayal, every name another knife in the back. But one name hit harder than the rest. Greg Peterson. My best friend since college, the guy who'd stood next to me at my wedding, who'd toasted to my success when I launched my company. He'd been on Langford's payroll for over a year, slipping him files and sitting in on meetings to report back. I stared at the file so long my vision blurred, hands shaking with rage. The betrayal was suffocating, like being gutted and left to bleed out slowly. By the time Friday rolled around, I was ready to burn it all down. I spent the morning at my lawyer's office, drawing up divorce papers that would leave Victoria with nothing but memories. I didn't give a damn about the house or the cars or the designer wardrobe she loved so much. The only thing I wanted was custody of Liam and the satisfaction of watching her world go up in flames. The lawyers were more than happy to oblige. Adultery clauses, financial disclosures, infidelity evidence. Every line was a nail in the coffin of our marriage. I signed my name with a steady hand, each stroke of the pen a little more final. Victoria texted at noon, something about dinner plans and how she wanted to talk, but I left her on read. I had bigger fish to fry. That evening, I invited Greg out for drinks, our usual bar, the one down by the river with the whiskey flights and dark corners. He showed up 10 minutes late, sleeves rolled and grin wide, like nothing was wrong, like he hadn't been feeding my worst enemy every damn secret I had. Long day? He asked, clapping a hand on my shoulder. The urge to break his fingers was almost overwhelming. You could say that, I replied smoothly, signaling for 2 bourbons. Needed a drink. We made small talk for half an hour, sports, the office, his wife's latest shopping spree. I listened, nodded, pretended my hands weren't shaking with the need to smash his face into the bar. Then I slipped the manila envelope onto the table, watching his smile falter. "What's that?" he asked, eyes narrowing. "Proof," I said, voice low and cold, "that you're a lying, backstabbing son of a bitch." His face went white. For a moment he just stared at the file, at the emails and bank transfers and surveillance photos, like if he blinked hard enough it might all disappear. Then he started to sputter, eyes wide and desperate. "Max, wait. I can explain." "Explain." I barked out a laugh, sharp and bitter. "Go ahead, Greg. Explain how you've been selling me out to Langford for a year. Explain how you looked me in the eye every day and lied through your teeth." "Listen," he choked out, hands shaking. "It's not what you think," he blackmailed me. "I didn't have a choice." "Bullshit." My voice cut like glass. "You could have come to me. You didn't. You took the money and stabbed me in the back. So here's what's going to happen." I leaned in, eyes cold and steady. "You're going to give me every piece of dirt you've got on Langford, emails, deals, names, everything. Or I swear to God, I'll ruin you." He swallowed hard, eyes darting to the bartender, to the door. Anywhere but my face. I could almost see the wheels turning, weighing options, calculating how fast he could run. But then his shoulders slumped, defeated. "I'll get you what you need," he mumbled, voice small. "Just, please, Max, don't go public. My wife, my kids. Should have thought about them before you sold me out." I snapped. "You've got 24 hours. I left him there, slumped over the bar, hands shaking. The city lights blurred in the windshield as I drove, anger simmering hot and ugly beneath my skin. I'd spent years building my company, my marriage, my life, brick by careful brick. And in a matter of months, Langford had torn it all down. The only thing left was revenge. Cold, calculated, and ruthless. I pulled up to the house just after midnight, exhaustion dragging at me, but something stopped me cold. The living room light was on, soft and warm, spilling through the curtains. And parked 2 houses down was a sleek black sedan I'd never seen before. My heart thundered in my ears as I approached, fingers curling into fists. I edged around the back, slipping through the side gate and pressing close to the window. Inside, Victoria stood by the fireplace, arms crossed, face pale. And across from her, lounging like he owned the place, was Richard. My blood ran ice cold. I couldn't hear the words, just the low rumble of Richard's voice, Victoria's quiet pleas. But when he gripped her arm, yanking her close, something in me snapped. I was at the door in a heartbeat, keys rattling, shoving it open so hard it cracked against the wall. They froze, eyes wide and guilty, and for a moment, none of us moved. Then Richard's hand dropped, slow and calculated, and he smirked. "Max," he drawled, smug as sin. "Didn't expect you home so soon." My fists clenched, rage boiling over. "Get the hell out of my house," I snarled, voice deadly calm. Richard chuckled, eyes glinting. "Your house?" he taunted, voice slick and mocking. "From where I'm standing, looks like you're the one who doesn't belong here." And Victoria, my wife, didn't say a word. For a long moment, none of us moved. The room was so quiet I could hear my own breathing, harsh and ragged, the tick of the wall clock slicing through the silence. Richard leaned casually against the armchair, one hand in his pocket, the other still lingering too close to Victoria. My wife, the woman who was supposed to have my back. But she just stood there, eyes wide and lips parted, like she couldn't quite process that she'd been caught. The smug grin on Richard's face was enough to snap me out of my shock. Without thinking, I lunged, fist connecting with his jaw with a sickening crack. He stumbled back with a grunt, crashing into the coffee table, but the bastard had the nerve to laugh, wiping blood from the corner of his mouth. "That all you got, Max?" he sneered, eyes glinting. "No wonder she came to me. That did it." I was on him in an instant, fists flying, blind with rage. He got a few good hits in. One split my lip, another left my ribs throbbing. But I barely felt it. All I could see was red. All I could think about was making him pay. Max, stop! Victoria's voice cut through the chaos, sharp and panicked. Hands clawed at my arm, dragging me back, nails biting into my skin. Stop it! You're going to kill him. Maybe I should. I snarled, voice low and deadly. My fist tightened in Richard's collar, breath coming hard and fast. His eyes flickered with something. Fear, maybe. But he masked it quick, lips curling into a smirk. Touch me again, he drawled, voice smug despite the blood staining his teeth. And I'll have you arrested for assault. I almost laughed. Try me? I spat, shoving him hard enough that he hit the wall with a grunt. But then Victoria was between us, hands splayed on my chest, eyes pleading. Max, please, she gasped, voice shaking. Just let him go. Please. The betrayal hit like a gut punch, raw and suffocating. She was protecting him, not me, not her husband of 13 years, but the damn driver she'd been screwing behind my back. Are you kidding me? I choked out, voice cracking. You're defending him? It's not. She broke off, voice wavering. Her eyes were rimmed red, mascara smudged, but I couldn't tell if the tears were for me or him. It's not what you think. Bullshit. The word snapped out, vicious and venomous. I saw you, Victoria. I saw everything. Her face crumpled, hands dropping limp at her sides. But before she could get a word out, Richard's dark chuckle sliced through the silence. Well, this is awkward, he drawled, straightening with a grimace. But since the cat's out of the bag, he pulled something from his jacket pocket and tossed it onto the coffee table with a smirk. A sleek black flash drive. My stomach dropped. What the hell is that? I bit out. Insurance, Richard said smoothly, lips curling. Langford's not exactly sentimental. Figured you might do something stupid, so he asked me to gather a little leverage. A cold chill slid down my spine. I snatched up the flash drive, fingers shaking, and jammed it into the laptop on the kitchen counter. The files popped up instantly, spreadsheets, emails, photos, everything. Client lists, blueprints, financials, all the sensitive information I'd spent years keeping locked down. You son of a bitch, I rasped, throat tight. You set me up. Richard's smirk widened. You're a smart guy, Max, he said mockingly. Took you long enough to figure it out. Wait, what is this? Victoria's voice was small, confused. Her eyes darted between us, wide and terrified. Richard, what did you... Oh, come on, Vic, Richard scoffed, rolling his eyes. You didn't really think this was about love, did you? Jesus, you're dumber than I thought. Her face went white. You used me? She whispered, voice raw. No offense, sweetheart, but you made it easy, he sneered. Max was too busy playing CEO to notice you were miserable. All I had to do was show up with a few compliments and a pretty smile. He shrugged, eyes glinting. Hell, you practically threw yourself at me. The slap came out of nowhere, Victoria's palm cracking across his face with enough force to echo. For a second, she just stared at him, chest heaving, tears streaking mascara down her cheeks. Then she turned to me, eyes wide and desperate. Max, please, you have to believe me. I didn't know. Oh, save it. I snapped, voice cold and hollow. You made your choice. Now live with it. The cops showed up 20 minutes later, courtesy of one of the neighbors, who'd called in a domestic disturbance. They hauled Richard out in cuffs, but not before he shot me a grin over his shoulder, eyes glinting with dark amusement. You're already dead, Max, he taunted, voice low and smug. Langford's got enough dirt to bury you alive. Might want to get used to that view from the bottom. I lunged, but the officer shoved me back, barked something about obstruction, and slammed the door on Richard's smug face. Victoria flinched at the sound, arms wrapped tight around herself, eyes rimmed red. But when she tried to speak, tried to touch my arm, I jerked back, lip curling. Don't, I snarled. Don't you dare. Her face crumpled, but I couldn't bring myself to care. The betrayal was suffocating, raw and bleeding. Everything I thought I knew about her, about our life, was a lie. I spent that night on the couch, staring at the ceiling, the divorce papers burning a hole in my briefcase. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw them. Victoria's fingers in Richard's hair, his smug grin, the way she'd pleaded for him instead of me. But underneath the rage, something else simmered, cold and sharp and deadly. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. Langford wanted a war? Fine. I'd burn him to the ground if it was the last thing I did. And if Victoria got caught in the crossfire, well, that was just collateral damage. The morning after Richard was arrested, I launched my counterattack. I sent a press release exposing Langford's shell companies, insider trading, and bribery. It didn't take long for my phone to light up. Langford himself, voice smug and mocking. "You think this is over?" he sneered. "By tomorrow, the SEC will be knocking on your door." He hung up before I could respond, but his words left me cold. If he'd forged documents to frame me, I was screwed. My hands shook as I stared at the phone, rage and panic twisting in my gut. When I got home, the house was dark and quiet. Victoria's car was gone, but an envelope lay on the kitchen counter. My name scrawled in her handwriting. I ripped it open, eyes skimming the shaky lines. She confessed to everything. The affair, Richard's manipulation, how he'd used her to spy on me. But one line hit like a bullet. "Liam isn't yours." The words blurred, bile rising in my throat. My son, the boy I'd raised, coached, tucked in at night, wasn't mine. I sank into a chair, head in my hands, breaths coming fast and shallow. 3 days later, the paternity test came back. 0%. I stared at the paper, chest hollow, the world spinning. Footsteps patted down the hall. Liam's. His voice was small, hesitant. "Dad? You okay?" I looked up, eyes burning, forcing a smile that hurt. "Yeah, kid," I rasped. "I'm fine." But the papers lay between us, dark and damning, and I knew nothing would ever be fine again.